Chapter 8 is an application chapter, and we look at the costs of taxation. This chapter uses the tools of welfare economics to analyze the effects of a tax. It explores the relationships between the price elasticities of demand and supply with the deadweight loss of a tax. The material in this chapter is very important. The government must raise revenue to pay for things like the police, the court system, interstate highways, national defense, public education, and so on. The government must also choose which goods to tax and how much to tax each one to raise revenues. Effective tax policy generates the needed revenue while striving for efficiency and equity among who pays the taxes. A lot of times, efficiency and equity will conflict. This is not one of our longer chapters in this text. However, it is an interesting chapter and an important one for your learning experience. So, first of all, let's review chapter 6 and what a tax is. So, again, a tax drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. There's essentially a wedge in between those two things. A tax also raises the price buyers pay and lowers the price that sellers receive. A tax also reduces the quantity bought and sold. These effects are the same whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. So no matter whoever pays the higher price because of the tax, the buyer or the seller. So we do not make this distinction in the chapter. We don't worry about who's paying it here. So let's take a look at the effects of a tax. There's an equilibrium with no tax where the price is at PE, price equilibrium, and the quantity is at QE, quantity equilibrium. So where supply and demand meet, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Now, looking at the equilibrium with a tax, the tax dollar amount per unit is taken into account. So buyers pay price B, okay, price buyers, and sellers receive price S, price for sellers. The difference between these two, what the seller is getting and what the buyer is paying, is a tax. Okay. This leads to a quantity of T. Again, at the higher price, buyers would want a lower quantity, so we move from QE to QT. And at a lower price rather than what they would have gotten at equilibrium, because again the tax is driving up price, so buyers are going to want less because they're paying a higher price. The sellers are going to get less revenue for their goods because it's at a higher price, so quantity again is reduced. The difference between the price that the sellers get and the price that the buyers pay is a tax. So again, it drives this wedge in here, okay? That reduces the quantity sold because it's more expensive for a buyer to acquire whatever good is being taxed. Okay, so the effect of a tax then here is this red area you see. Revenue from the tax is the dollar tax amount times the quantity sold under the tax. So it's essentially this space here. Okay, that's the additional revenue. Again, this is the price that the seller's getting. This is the price that the buyer's getting. This red rectangle with both areas here is the size of the tax, the amount of revenue generated. So let's take a look at the effects of a tax. Next, we apply welfare economics to measure the gains and losses from a tax, because obviously we saw that a tax drives a wedge there. So there's some changes, there's some gainers, there's some losses there. We determine that what the consumer surplus and producer surplus, tax revenue, and total surplus with and without a tax would be. And we look at the fact that tax revenue can fund beneficial services like education, roads, police. So we have to include that in the total surplus. So again, to provide those types of services, a government must raise money. must raise revenue to provide things like education, roads, and police. But that has an effect on the market. So let's look at the effects of a tax. First of all, we look at without a tax. Consumer surplus, again, is areas A, B, and C above the price curve, below the demand curve. Or, excuse me, above the price and below the demand curve. A, B, C is the consumer surplus. Producer surplus then is D, E, F, the area below the price but above the supply curve. Tax revenue is 0 because we don't have a tax in this situation. And total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, which is essentially A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. That's the total surplus. So pretty straightforward, something we've covered throughout this course. Now, the effects of a tax, we have the tax in place here. Again, we have a buyer's paying a higher price and sellers getting a lower price because we have the wedge of the tax in between. Consumer surplus, remember before was A, B, and C. Now it's reduced to just A, the area above the price line and below the demand curve. Tax revenue, though, is this B plus D. Again, that was, if you remember from the previous slide, this is the same thing that was that red rectangle, two areas of the red rectangle. And total surplus is A plus B plus D plus F. A plus B plus D plus F. The tax reduces total surplus by areas C and E because we're no longer selling quantity here, quantity, the original equilibrium, but quantity at the tax, or with the tax rather. So again, in this scenario, we're counting the revenue raised by a government to provide public services as part of our total surplus. So we went from having a total area of A, B, C, D, E, F to having a total surplus of A, B, D, F. And we lost C and E. C and E, what we lost is called a deadweight loss, sometimes abbreviated DWL. It's the deadweight loss of the tax, and it's the fall in the total surplus that results from a market distortion such as a tax. And again, the tax creates a market distortion because for the buyers it raises the price and it lowers the price received for the sellers. It's an outside intervention of a free market. So let's talk about the deadweight loss. Because of the tax, the units between QT and QE are not sold, this triangle here. The value of these units to buyers is greater than the cost of producing them. So the tax prevents some mutually beneficial trades. Again, the free market, the invisible hand, would move us to an equilibrium here, and this whole area of surplus would go to producers and buyers. Okay, we would have a slightly larger producer and consumer surplus. But what determines the size of the deadweight loss? Which goods or services should the government tax to raise the revenue it needs? Well, the answer is those with the smallest deadweight loss. We want to minimize deadweight loss. So when is deadweight loss small versus large? Well, it turns out that it depends a lot on price elasticities of supply and demand, which we covered previously. So recall that the price elasticity of demand measures how much quantity demanded changes when price changes. Conversely, the price elasticity of supply measures the quantity supplied, or how much the quantity supplied changes when price changes. So looking at deadweight loss and the elasticity of supply, when supply is inelastic, we have this pretty much vertical supply curve, very little elasticity. Pardon me. Very little elasticity, supply is inelastic. It's harder for firms to leave the market when the tax reduces the price that sellers receive. Okay, so if you're less elastic, you're less likely to leave the market. So the tax only reduces the quantity just a little. You can see here originally we had a quantity here where they intersect. we're moving back to this quantity supplied. There's very little distance between those two areas. So the tax only reduces quantity a little, and the deadweight loss is small. So there's a smaller response by sellers when their supply is inelastic. So when there's no tax, the market equilibrium quantities maximizes total surplus. The tax causes the price sellers receive to fail, or excuse me, the tax causes the price that sellers receive to fall. So sellers will supply a smaller quantity, and the new equilibrium quantity falls below the one that maximizes total surplus. Again, that's that movement from equilibrium back to the quantity when there's a tax. Hence, that creates a deadweight loss. Now, in this example, in this graph, when the supply is inelastic, sellers do not reduce their quantity much below the surplus maximizing quantity. So, therefore, the deadweight loss that we see in a very inelastic supply here is relatively small. Now, let's look at it with an elastic supply. You can remember before we had a very vertical supply curve, is very inelastic. This one's far more elastic. So the more elastic the supply is, the easier for firms to leave the market when the tax reduces the prices sellers get. The quantity, the greater quantity falls below the surplus maximizing quantity, and there's thus a greater deadweight loss. So again, this would be the QE. You have a supply curve that's far more elastic, means there's going to be more movement along the supply curve in terms of quantity supplied. So when the price is reduced to this point on the supply curve, remember this is going to move from having a price roughly, follow my cursor here, price roughly here, to a price that sellers receive to here. Buyers are going to pay this price. Price goes down for sellers. They're fairly elastic supply, so there's going to be a greater reduction in the quantity. So in this graph, the demand curve, equilibrium price, and the size of the tax are identical to those in the graph in the preceding slide. The only thing that's different is the supply curve. Here it's flatter, and as a result, the same size tax as before will cause a larger deadweight loss. So a lot depends on the elasticity of the supply curve. Well, let's take a look at the demand curve. So demand here is pretty inelastic, pretty vertical, not a lot of movement. It's harder for consumers to leave the market when the tax raises the price buyers pay in this situation. So the tax only reduces quantity a little, and the deadweight loss is small, as illustrated here in this yellow triangle. The tax raises the price buyers pay, and therefore reduces the quantity demanded. The equilibrium quantity falls below the surplus maximizing quantity that should be found in the equilibrium QE, but not as much as when the demand curve is inelastic. So it's fairly inelastic, so there's a smaller deadweight loss. Now, just like supply, when demand is more elastic, it's easier for the buyers to leave the market when the tax increases the price that buyers pay. The more quantity falls below the surplus maximizing quantity, the greater the deadweight loss area. Okay, in this graph, the supply curve, equilibrium price, and size of the tax are identical to the previous graph that we showed looking at an inelastic demand. However, the only thing that's different in this demand curve is much flatter, and as a result, the same size tax as before causes a larger deadweight loss. So again, it depends on whether the quantity, how much the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded changes, and that depends on the elasticity of supply and demand. So all this begs the question, how big should government be? Because the bigger the government, the more we have to raise tax revenue to fund it. And that means market disruptions. So a bigger government provides more services and requires higher taxes, which causes deadweight losses. The larger the deadweight loss from taxation, the greater the argument for smaller government. The tax on labor income is especially important. So it's the biggest source of government revenue. Okay, so you tax on your income, payroll, your payroll taxes, your what the government takes from your check each pay period. For the typical worker, the marginal tax rate, that is the tax on the last dollar of earnings, is about 40%. So across the board, you're looking at about 40% of your income going to tax revenue. So how big is the deadweight loss from this tax? Well, it depends on elasticity on a case-to-case basis. The next few slides are adapted from the section, the case study section, where we look at deadweight loss debate, which is in this chapter of the textbook. The title of this slide is actually a direct quote from that section. How big should government be? Why the marginal tax rate is relevant is important. It's one of the 10 principles from chapter 1 is rational people think at the margin, if you recall. This applies to workers as well. When Susan considers increasing her hours worked, she takes into account the extra income she'd earn from working a few more hours a week. The extra income on an additional hour equals the hourly wage minus the marginal tax rate. So you're looking at net income if you work a little more. So you're thinking at the margin when you're considering working more. So if labor supply, again, labor as a commodity, labor supply is inelastic, then the deadweight loss will be small. Some economists believe that labor supply is somewhat inelastic and argue that most workers work full-time regardless of their wage. This is up for debate. We can certainly get into more detail outside of class if you'd like. But according to this view, the deadweight loss from labor taxes is small, assuming that labor supply is in fact inelastic. This is relevant to the question of how big the government should be, because a high deadweight loss would argue to restraining the size of government. Other economists believe labor taxes are highly distorting because some groups of workers have elastic supply and can respond to incentives. Many workers can adjust their hours, for example, by working overtime or not working overtime. Many families have a second earner with discretion over whether and how much to work. As taxes go up, you lose more and more of your pay. It becomes more of a disincentive to work because you come closer to making a choice, say, from working to staying home and saving on things like childcare. Many elderly choose when to retire based on the wage they earn. So if you lower that wage, it could affect their decision. Again, a distortion. Some people work what's called in the quote-unquote underground economy to evade high taxes. A good example of that is if you had someone come out to your home and do some work and you said, hey, can I pay you under the table for this, and you'll cut the price. That's essentially tax evasion. I think pretty much everyone's done it at some point in their life, though. But that is in response to the presence of a tax, so it's a bit of a market distortion. The effects of changing the size of the tax, essentially changing the size of the tax is changing the size of government, because the tax revenue is the fuel that government runs on. These effects include policymakers often changing taxes and raising some and lowering others. That affects the amount of tax revenue out there. And what happens to the deadweight loss in tax revenue when the taxes change? We'll explore this next. So looking at deadweight loss and the size of the tax, let's look at it graphically here. Initially, the tax is, in this graph here, T per unit. Okay. This is your original equilibrium, doubling the tax because the deadweight loss to more than double. Okay, this was the first. Let's say that the first tax caused a buyer's price here, a seller's price here. You had an initial deadweight loss as this orange area here. Let's say the tax doubles, then buyers are paying a price that includes a much wider tax. Again, the difference between the price that sellers pay or get paid, the price that sellers get paid, and the price that buyers pay. This whole area right here would be the tax. Okay, so this is the first tax. This is the second tax. This is the tax getting bigger. Well, what happens? This wedge gets bigger. Okay, so deadweight loss here versus deadweight loss overall. Deadweight loss more than doubled. The new deadweight loss is actually, in this graph, 4 times the initial deadweight loss, even though the tax is just twice as large. So as you can see, just any increase in the tax is going to have exponential increases in the deadweight loss. Initially, the tax is, let's look at increasing the tax again. This is the original tax here. Sellers are getting this price. If you follow my cursor and imagine a line there, buyers are paying this price. That is the original tax. Now, let's look at a tripling the tax causes a deadweight loss to more than triple. So you triple the tax from here. Remember, we doubled it in the previous slide. Look at this gigantic deadweight loss. This new deadweight loss is 9 times the initial deadweight loss, even though the taxes is only 3 times larger. So expect exponential increases in deadweight loss compared to the increases in taxes. Kind of a big deal. So deadweight loss and the size of the tax. The implication here is in the green box is not in the textbook, so it's not really supported by the study guide or your test bank that you do your homework out of. But what we're looking at is when tax rates are low, raising them doesn't cause much harm, and lowering them doesn't bring much benefit. It's somewhat marginal. When the tax rates are high, raising them is very harmful. Again, we had that exponential increase in deadweight loss, and cutting them is very beneficial. So we have to figure out how to walk that thin line between providing government services without government becoming this big behemoth that has exponential effects on deadweight loss to society. So when a tax increases, deadweight loss rises even more. So there's a gradual increase in deadweight loss as tax size increases. Now, this is the Laffer curve, which shows the relationship between the size of a tax and tax revenue. The Laffer curves shown here and in the book are symmetric, and their peak occurs in the middle. I would be remiss if I didn't mention to you that this is not necessarily always the case, and probably actually not the case. However, we just don't know where the peak is, so this is just for instructional purposes. It could be at a tax rate of 20%. Again, we don't know the scale here is essentially what I'm saying. Or it could be a tax rate of 200,000. But what we need to know is as you increase the tax, the effects that we've discussed previously magnify. The textbook has some excellent discussion on the Laffer curve, in particular as it relates to the administration of President Reagan and supply side economics. Essentially what you need to take away from the Laffer curve is most people think, well, hey, as taxes increase, tax revenues are going to increase on an increasing rate. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Eventually, the tax gets so high, the tax revenue starts to decline. Why? Well, okay, if you go to work tomorrow and you get to take home 90% of your pay and 10% goes to taxes, you're probably going to go to work the next day. 80% probably going to go to work next day. 70% probably going to go to work the next day. You're going to keep earning revenue and generating tax revenue. However, if you keep going to where you're paying half or more of your pay, eventually you're going to say, well, it's just not worth it. It's not worth working more. Say you're getting an hourly rate. The more you work, the more taxes you pay, you're going to work less. So eventually it gets to a point where tax revenue actually begins to decline as tax size increases. Hope that makes sense. That's the whole purpose of a Laffer curve. So in summary, again, a short chapter here. A tax on a good reduces the welfare of buyers and sellers. This welfare loss usually exceeds the revenue the tax raises for the government. So we have to be mindful of it. The fall in total surplus, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and tax revenue, is called the deadweight loss of the tax. A tax has a deadweight loss because it causes some consumers to buy less because they're paying that higher price to buy, and producers to sell less because they're getting less money because of that wedge driven in there by the tax. Thus, it shrinks the market below the level that maximizes total surplus. Essentially, we move away from equilibrium. The price elasticities of demand and supply measure how much buyers and sellers respond to price changes. Therefore, higher elasticities imply higher deadweight losses. So when something's more elastic in economics, that means there's going to be a greater response in quantity supplied and quantity demanded changes, depending on whether we're talking about a elastic supply or elastic demand curve. An increase in the size of the tax causes the deadweight loss to rise even more. That's that exponential thing we illustrated in the graphs with the large pink box versus large pink triangle versus the smaller orange original deadweight loss for the original taxes. So an increase in the size of a tax causes revenues to rise at first, but eventually revenue falls because the tax reduces the size of the market. And that's what we're talking about with the Laffer curve. All right, this wraps up the very short Chapter 8, the cost of taxation. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. I'll be happy to discuss it with you. Thank you so much.